Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Southwest. My name is Bryan. I'm the pulpit minister here. I'm so delighted to see all of you. And if this is one of your first times at Southwest, welcome. And I hope you have a wonderful experience. And I hope that this is a church that you can call home in the near future. In a couple of weeks, we're going to be celebrating our high school seniors. And we've got two incredible seniors that are graduating this year, Fisher and Olivia. We've got some opportunities to bless them and encourage them and to celebrate them. So we'll be taking some time on May, what is that Sunday? May 5th, in a couple weeks, to celebrate them during service. And we've got some opportunities to bless them between now and then. So we've got some laundry baskets that are floating around the church somewhere, and it's got their names on it, the college that they're thinking about going to or have committed to already. And I know they would really like cards to kind of encourage them. And I know they would really like cards that have money embedded into them as well. So either of those would be a wonderful, wonderful way to bless them and to show them the love of the Southwest family here. So be on the lookout for that. If you can't do that this week, obviously we've got a couple weeks to do that. So we started a new message series. You've kind of heard a little bit of the references to it so far, called Good, Good Father. And it's a message series based out of Exodus 34, 6 through 7. And it's focusing on the heart or the character of God. And he takes an opportunity in Exodus to pass in front of Moses and to speak his name and to reveal the kind of God that he is. And I want to pause before we read our theme verse for the day. I want to pause and kind of answer the question, why is it so important to study the heart of God? Why is it so important to have this conversation about who God is and what he's like? And based off of my experience working with churches, working with people, just my time in the Word, one of those things that I've kind of come to realize is that the kind of relationship we have with God is based on the things we believe about God. And so if we have this view of God where he is harsh and judgmental and out to get us, then our relationship with God is going to reflect that. We're probably going to be afraid of him all of the time. If we have a view of God where he's unpredictable, we don't know what he's going to do next, then we're going to have a relationship with God where we're constantly walking on eggshells around him. And if we have a view of God that he is this absent father, someone who maybe created us but then withdrew from our lives, and we're probably not going to want to invest in a relationship with God at all. So it's important for us to know who God is, because the things that we believe about God are going to determine the kind of relationship we have with him. So in Exodus 34, 6 through 7, when God passed in front of Moses, he told us the kind of God he is. He passed in front of Moses proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. Now today we're focusing on the second attribute that God mentions there. Last week was that he was a compassionate father, and today it's that he is a gracious father. So what do you think God means when he tells us that he is a gracious God? And how would that impact our relationship with him on a day-to-day basis if we really took God at his word, that he is a God of grace, a gracious Father? Those are some of the questions that we're going to talk through, and hopefully you'll have some better understanding of those ideas by the end of the message today. But I just want to start with the big picture and make sure that we're kind of on the same page about what I mean when I use the word grace. It's come up in a lot of the songs in our communion meditation in the welcome. This has been an awesome service just because it's focused so much on the grace of God. But I want to tell you in advance what comes to my mind when I use the word grace or I hear the word grace in a church context. So when I use the word grace, it's really in line with what Paul talked about in Ephesians 2, 1 through 10, our scripture reading for today. And I think of it as God's intentional decision to lavish us with gifts and blessings we don't deserve, and especially the gift of salvation because of his great love for us. Now, you could probably go on and on and on to further define that and to drill down a little bit deeper into it, but that's basically what comes to my mind, that God makes an intentional choice, no one is forcing him to do it, to lavish us, to give us things generously, to lavish us way more than what we can imagine, these gifts and blessings, things that are undeniably positive and beneficial for us. And he's giving us these things that we really don't deserve. It's not like you work really hard and you get a paycheck for God that reflects how awesome of a person you are. This is a gift we truly don't deserve. And the reason God does this is because of his great love for us. We receive these blessings and these gifts through our relationship with Jesus, and especially because of what Jesus accomplished on the cross, his death, his burial, and the resurrection. So we're talking about the fact that God is a God of grace, a gracious Father. And when the Old Testament uses this word grace, when it talks about this idea of grace, this idea up on the screen is a big part of it. It's obviously before Jesus and the cross, so they weren't exactly thinking about grace in terms of God's Messiah died on the cross for my sins. But even before Jesus, and even before the tabernacle or the temple where they would start animal sacrifices one day, even before they had that, the people of God knew that one of the clearest signs that God was a God of grace was his willingness to forgive us when we sinned. And not because we deserved that forgiveness or could somehow earn our way back into his good graces. The clearest sign of God's grace was his willingness to forgive us when we least deserved it. I want to put part of Psalm 51, the first couple of verses from that. These words were written by King David right after his very infamous sin with Bathsheba and then murdering Uriah and probably a lot of other soldiers to cover it up and try and dig his way out of this hole. He's finally confronted by the prophet Nathan, who helps David realize the seriousness of his sin, how badly he has messed up. And when David starts to realize what he's done wrong, he writes this prayer of confession that's now Psalm 51 in our Bibles. And it says, "Have mercy on me," which is the same word that God uses for grace. He says, "Be gracious with me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin." When David asks God for forgiveness, he's not appealing to who he is, to who David is, or the positive things that he might try and do to say sorry or to make up for it. When David asks for forgiveness, he appeals to the kind of God that God is, the compassionate and merciful God, the compassionate and gracious God, a God who is slow to anger and abounding in love and faithfulness. He uses three of the exact same words in Psalm 51 that God uses to describe himself in Exodus 34. So he's appealing to who God is, and he's appealing to the grace of God as he asks God for forgiveness. So throughout the Bible, this is a really strong connection that we see between grace and forgiveness. Throughout the Bible, grace and the forgiveness of sins go hand in hand. So we're going to go into it a little bit more about what grace would have meant in the original context, but I just want to make sure that everyone is on the same page, that the predominant idea behind grace in the Bible is God's willingness to forgive us when we sin and to give us a second chance and a third chance and a fourth chance down the line because of his great love for us and because of the kind of God that he is. So that being said, this idea of God's willingness to forgive us when we mess up, that was not the only thing that would have popped into Moses' mind. It's not the only thing that the Israelites would have started thinking about when they heard God say that he is a gracious God. And the reason that's not the only thing they would have thought of is because that in the Old Testament, grace was not an exclusively religious term. It was not a term that you only would have heard about as you read the Bible or only would have heard about as you went to the temple to worship God. It was actually a pretty big part of their social lives as well. And the idea of finding grace in someone else's eyes or finding favor in their eyes was the foundational principle of their social safety net. When something went wrong and you were in some kind of hole, you would count on the graciousness or the favor of other people who could step in to help you. And if we just take a couple minutes to explore what that sort of social side of grace looked like, it helps us understand what God is trying to communicate to Moses and the Israelites when he tells them that he is a gracious God. So here's kind of that social part of the word grace. It's something that would have come up in their society probably on a lot of occasions. Now, I want you to imagine just for a moment, let's teleport back in time to the time of Moses and the Israelites. I want you to imagine what life could have been like if you were a farmer in ancient Israel. And your livelihood was highly dependent on the right circumstances, the right weather, good crops, good workers who can go out and work the land for you. Your livelihood depended on that. Now, I want you to imagine that there was some kind of crisis. Now, whether it is a drought, whether it is a famine, whether your family gets injured, no one is able to work the land, you're facing some kind of crisis that directly threatens your livelihood. And it's so severe, you've tried everything on your own, and you realize there is nothing that you are able to do to fix your own situation. So what you have come to realize is that if there's any hope for your future, you have to go find someone else. Someone else with more power to fix the problem, with more resources to step in, with more authority. You've got to go to someone higher up. So what you would do is, because you're facing this crisis, you would go to the right person and you would hope and pray that you would find favor or grace in their eyes. And if you did, you'd be able to make your request. And because they looked so favorably down on you, they would be so moved in their heart, they would step in to address that problem for you. So it was this move from a crisis to a request to a decision. The hope is that as you made your appeal, you would be like Queen Esther here, who goes before the king and makes her appeal that he would step in and prevent evil Haman over here from executing all of the Jewish people in exile. Your hope is that the right person would step up at the right time to provide grace and assistance to help you in your time of need. There's several stories just like this. In Esther chapter 7, verse 3, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. Esther finds favor in the eyes of the king, and the king steps in to help. You also see this same phrase in the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis. He's sold into slavery. And yet he finds favor in the eyes of Potiphar. He finds favor in the eyes of the warden. He finds favor in the eyes of Pharaoh himself. That in his crisis, there's someone who steps in. He finds favor or grace in their eyes, and they're able to bless him. You also see it in the book of Ruth, when Ruth, who is a widow and a foreigner from the one country that was like the sworn enemy of Israel, finds herself in Israel with nothing to her name. She's entirely dependent on the generosity of other people. She goes out hoping to find favor in the eyes of the right person, and she finds herself in the fields of Boaz. Boaz shows favor on Ruth and gives her far more than what the book of the law actually requires of him. He lavishes her with more grace and blessings than she truly deserves and what's required. So the key concept behind this more social side of the word grace is that you have vulnerable people who are out of options seeking favor from the person who has the power and the resources to step in and help. And that's the cultural context that helps explain what Moses and the Israelites would have heard when God revealed himself as a compassionate and gracious God. He was telling them, I'm the kind of king that you can come to, and you are going to find favor in my eyes. You are going to have a God, a father, a king who is delighted to welcome you into his presence, a king who is excited about listening to your requests and stepping in to help you in your time of need. God uses this word in Hebrew to say that he is a gracious God. It's Hanun, and you kind of have to, it starts in the back of your throat there, Hanun, and it means to show favor or to be pleased with someone. And it's both an attitude where you're really pleased with them, you see something, you see someone, you're just really charmed by it, you're fascinated by it, you're enamored with it, you see something out there that just gives you that warm and fuzzy feeling inside. It starts as an attitude like that, but then it translates into this willingness to step in and help when that thing that you're fascinated with, enamored with, has some sort of request. It's with an attitude and an action. And there's some people in the room right now that you can probably trace your name to this Hebrew word for graciousness. So it's Hanun, but if your name is Hannah, your name comes straight from this word right here. You are a reminder of the graciousness of God. But also, as Hannah got sort of translated through different languages throughout the centuries, also Anne, Anna, Annette, also John, Joanna, names like that, they all have that root word of the grace of God. I know there's people in the room. I know you have family members with these names. They are God's gift to the world, right? That's what they're named after. You might not tell them that because their head might get really big, but they are a reminder of the graciousness of our God. And if you want to look at a human relationship that captures this dynamic of being enamored with someone, being fascinated by them, feeling in love, being charmed by them, I think it has to be grandparents with their grandkids. Amen. Because when your grandkids come and spend time with you and they kind of curl up in your lap, there's that twinkle in your eye. You're completely charmed. You're completely enamored with them. You're just so in love with them. And the feeling is mutual because they feel the exact same way about you. It's almost like the parent in the middle is just sort of the middleman facilitating this relationship. They're kind of the forgotten person in that dynamic with the grandkids, with their grandparents. You might even say, oh, my granddaughter has me wrapped around her finger. I'm so in love with her. I'm so taken by her that I'll do anything to make her happy. Have a tea party dressed as a princess? Absolutely. Right? Ice cream for breakfast? Let's do it. Like anything that you want, you're going to get because of that love that you have for them. Right? In the Old Testament times, people of influence would regularly give their favor or extend their grace to the movers and shakers of society. They didn't wait for someone to have a crisis. They would actually show this kind of favor, this kind of grace to really influential people. If you were rich and famous, if you were charming and attractive, if you were influential or an exemplary citizen, you were the kind of person that would probably get a lot of grace from the influential people in your society. Because there was this idea that if I do something great for you, now it's like you owe me. And so it was really smart for the top people in society to be well connected with other influential people. Basically, if you were able to be a blessing to someone else, you're the kind of person that would get a lot of grace in society. If you could bolster someone else's status or their reputation, people would be sort of fighting to do nice things for you so that you'd have to return their favor sometime. And so you can kind of take that concept and apply it to certain characters in the Bible. Seem like they do an exemplary job of following God, and so of course it makes sense that certain people in the Bible would find favor in the eyes of God. One example of that, it's the first time that the Bible mentions that someone finds favor in the eyes of God. It's the story of Noah. And that one's easy because like literally everyone else in the world is doing evil, turning away from God. Noah and his family are quite literally the one exception to that, the only people around doing the right thing. So Genesis chapter 6, verse 8 says, "But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord." And that makes sense because he's the only one doing the right thing. So, of course, someone like Noah would find favor or grace in God's eyes. Moses fits into that same category, too. Moses is up on Mount Sinai. He's dwelling in the presence of God. They're talking about the Ten Commandments and the law. Down below is where the rest of the Israelites are forming a golden calf idol and worshiping it and throwing a very inappropriate, sinful kind of party saying, this is the God who saved us. So Moses is quite literally the only person who is innocent, and so he finds favor in the eyes of the Lord. Let's read a little bit of that. This is Exodus 33. This happens right after the Israelites create the golden calf, but right before God reveals himself as the compassionate and gracious God. Okay, so this is kind of the in-between conversation. We've read it already, but I'm at this point just emphasizing this phrase of finding favor and trying to show you that, in a sense, Moses has earned the grace or the favor that God is showing him here by being the one person who isn't participating in this idolatry. So Exodus 33, 12 through 13, Moses said to the Lord, "You have been telling me, lead these people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. You have said, I know you by name, and you have found favor with me." That's that same word, grace. You have found grace, you have found favor with me. "If you are pleased with me," which is, again, the same phrase, they just translate it differently. "If you are pleased with me, if I have found favor in your eyes, teach me your ways so that I may know you and continue to find favor with you." Remember that this nation is your people. So remember that if you found favor in the eyes of the king or the eyes of that influential person, you could make your request and they would grant that request because of the grace that they are showing you, the favor that they are showing you. So that's what we see a couple verses later, Exodus 33:17, the Lord said to Moses, "I will do the very thing you have asked because I am pleased with you and I know you by name," because you have found favor in my eyes. And isn't it interesting that as we talked about compassion last week, we said how in the New Testament, compassion is associated with the guts. The Old Testament comes from the same word as a mother's womb. And the idea of grace is connected to the eyes. So there's a strong connection between these theological concepts, these feelings, but also the human body. I think that's an interesting idea there. So what I'm trying to illustrate right now is that there are certain people where it makes sense that they would stand in the grace of God, that they would find favor in the eyes of the king, because some people honestly just make it easy for God to give them favor. Moses, Noah, Jesus, the obvious example. You can look at the Bible and say, yeah, it makes sense. Like no one other than Jesus is perfect, but in the context of their stories, it makes sense that certain people, their righteousness would be so amazing that of course they would find favor in the eyes of God. But the reality is that most of us do not make it easy for God to give us his favor. Most of us fall short a lot. Most of us sin. Most of us aren't guys like Noah and Moses, and certainly not like Jesus. So if you're reading this story of Moses and the golden calf and the Israelites, if you're reading that and thinking, oh yeah, I'm totally like the Moses in this story, and the only one who's doing the right thing, it's everyone else that's the problem. I'm going to just go ahead and say, okay, there's like maybe a 1 in a million chance that that's true. But my experience working with people is that most of us should probably read this story and say, yeah, I'm the Israelites down at the bottom of Mount Sinai. That's who I relate to in the story. I'm the one who knows what I ought to be doing, but I'm not doing it. I'm the one that God has rescued, and yet still I'm turning to the things of the world instead of turning to God and putting my trust in him. One of my Bible professors at Pepperdine said, just as a general rule, when you read a story, you should probably associate yourselves with the worst person in that story and then work your way from there. All right. And so what I'm trying to say is that, yes, some people make it easy for God to give them their grace. Most of us don't. And the amazing thing about God's grace is that he gives us his grace anyway. The shocking lesson that Moses and the Israelites would have gotten out of God saying he is a gracious God, especially in light of what they had just done with the golden calf, was learning that he was a God who wasn't only going to show his favor to the right people who could pay him back, people that made it worthwhile for him. The shocking lesson they learned was that God was willing to show his grace and to give his favor to the people who did nothing to deserve it. So let's go back to this idea of a crisis, a request, and a decision. And let's start thinking about what that would mean for our relationship with God. I guess we're trying to follow Jesus today, the year 2024. We know what it would have meant for Moses and the Israelites about a crisis and making a request, hoping to find favor in the eyes of the right person. As we think about what that means for our relationship with God, let's just think for a second. If we take God at his word, that he really is a gracious God, a God who is enthusiastic about looking on us with favor, then that means whenever we face a crisis, and whether it's a spiritual crisis, like we are stuck in some kind of sin that we can't escape from, or we feel trapped by the guilt and shame about something that we've done or something that's happened to us, or maybe it's just a relational crisis, an emotional crisis, a mental health crisis. Whenever we face a situation that feels so overwhelming, we've exhausted all of our options, we're extremely vulnerable, we can't do anything to fix our own problem, what God is telling us is that we have a loving and gracious God that we can turn to. And we can go to him and ask him for exactly what we need to make it through that crisis. God is telling us when we come to him, he will look on us with favor because he is a gracious Father. And he will give us grace, not because of who we are, or the things that we might be able to do for God that'll make it worth his while. He's going to give us that grace to help us in our time of need because of who he chooses to be. Because he is a compassionate and gracious God, a God who is patient with us, slow to anger, abounding in love, and abounding in faithfulness. As we go into the New Testament now, there's a book of the Bible that talks about grace from this perspective. This idea of being like Queen Esther, and going into the presence of the king. Esther didn't know for sure if that king would welcome her or kind of go off with her head for showing up uninvited. There's a book of the Bible, Hebrews, that talks about coming to God's throne and being confident because we know that God is a gracious God. So we can read Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 through 16, and I think the writer of Hebrews has this Old Testament view of finding favor in mind as he writes these words, as he reminds us of the grace that we have through Jesus. As I read it, see if you can pick up on those same themes of going to the right person, hoping to find their favor, asking them for exactly what you need in your time of crisis. It says, therefore, Hebrews 4:14, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. The key difference now, as opposed to someone like Ruth or opposed to someone like Esther, who would have to go to the right person and make their requests all on their own and just hope that that person would show them grace. The difference now is that we have Jesus, our high priest, who died on the cross for the sins of the world. He knows what it's like to be in our shoes. He can empathize with our weakness. And now, Jesus, that perfect high priest, is our mediator. He is advocating for us. We're not approaching God's throne alone. We've got Jesus by our side who knows the Father and knows us and is advocating for us. And because of what Jesus did for us, we can be confident that as we boldly approach the throne of God, God will give us the grace we need in our time of need. There's one more little part to this story that I'm going to tell you. It's part of the story of Moses and God. We read the little conversation after the golden calf, but before God spoke his name, about how Moses had found favor, and he's making his requests known to God, and God is granting those requests because of the grace that he's given Moses. Right after God reveals his name and his character to Moses, Moses once again makes one more request of God. He makes one more appeal to that favor that God has given him, and he asks for one more thing, and it's an incredible foreshadow of the gospel message. And one of the things that Jesus did for us, one of the things Jesus prayed for when he was on the cross. So we're going to teleport back in time once again. I know it's like the Back to the Future thing. We're going back and forth, Old Testament and New Testament. We're back in Exodus 34, and God has just spoken his name and revealed his character. The immediate reaction that Moses has is in Exodus 34:8. Moses bowed to the ground and at once worshiped. And I love that. When we come face to face with the goodness of God, it calls us to a life of worship. Lord, he said in verse 9, if I have found favor in your eyes, then let the Lord go with us. Although this is a stiff-necked people, forgive our wickedness and our sin, and take us as your inheritance. When Moses had a chance to make one more request to God, he asked that God would forgive the sin of the people. But I want you to notice that Moses doesn't say, forgive their sin, those guys, forgive their wickedness, their transgressions. Moses uses the word our sin, our wickedness, our evil. Moses is willingly associating himself with the sin of the people, even though he was innocent of the crime. Moses was using his status as the favored prophet, the favored servant of God, to take on the sin of the people for himself, and he uses his request to ask that those guilty people would be forgiven. And think of the way that that points ahead to Jesus, the Son of God, the Son of God who's described in Luke chapter 2:52 as growing in favor with God. When Jesus was baptized, God spoke the words, this is my Son whom I love, with whom I am well pleased. The language is that Jesus dwelled in the grace of God, that he found favor in the eyes of God. And as the favored servant, the favored Messiah, one of the things that Jesus did on the cross was to look out at all of the sinful people. And he prays in Luke 23:34, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Moses, the favored servant, Jesus, the favored son, both use their favored status to ask for God to forgive the guilty people. Jesus died on the cross for our sins, and as he was dying, his mind was on us, his heart was connected to ours, and he was praying that God would forgive us, forgive the world of our sins, so that we could have eternal life with him one day. So the idea here behind this grace of God is that, yes, God forgives our sins 100%. That is the key idea. But as you kind of unpack the cultural side of this and understand the way that it worked in their society, and when you kind of combine that with Hebrews chapter 4, I think the key idea I hope you'll walk away with today is that because of Jesus, we can approach God's throne with confidence in our time of need. Whether that is forgiveness, the gift of salvation, maybe what you need is wisdom to get through a difficult moment in your life. You're not sure what direction to go. Maybe you need comfort. Maybe you need encouragement. Anything else, we can go to God and find grace in our time of need. Our next song is an invitation song, and that's an opportunity for us to go to God, to tell him exactly what we need, exactly how he can be there for us. And if there's anything that you want to discuss with one of the shepherds of this church, people who love you, that they love God, they're men of the word, and they can provide a lot of guidance and support and encouragement to you. If there's anything that you'd like to talk or pray about with one of them, they'll be available for you guys at the back of the room. So let's go ahead and stand and sing and worship our compassionate and gracious God.